there, beyond the 200-mile limit, is a huge realm that belongs to nobody and to everybody. The high seas, according to international convention, are the common heritage of mankind. But because the high seas belong to everybody, nobody effectively protects them. Enter Sarika Cullis-Suzuki. The ocean flows through our veins, so it's in us to protect it, says Sarika. She's an expert on the marine life of the Pacific Northwest and on high seas fisheries. She's also done extensive research on marine wildlife sanctuaries and on the feeble organizations which are supposed to manage the fisheries in the open ocean. She's currently studying for her PhD at the University of York in England. Sarika Cullis-Suzuki is also a gifted interpreter of science for general audiences. She writes for online newspapers like The Tyee, she speaks at conferences, and she's produced several television documentaries on preserving the oceans. Her co-producer on some of these projects has been that other Suzuki, her father, David Suzuki, the legendary scientist and environmental broadcaster. Huffington Post Canada has called Sarika Cullis-Suzuki one of generation-wise leaders, game changers, and inspirational figures. She recently turned 30. Where does your love for the sea come from? Because this is really part of the expression of that, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I've been very fortunate to have grown up by the ocean my entire life. So I was born in Vancouver in the 1980s, and we live by the ocean in Kitsilano. And my folks always thought it was really important to take us to provincial parks growing up. And so we would go to various places and go fishing and swimming and camping, and we'd pick berries and all that. And so just by spending that enormous amount of time outside and appreciating things, and you know, I learned to snorkel before I could swim because I was always sinking, so my mom put a mask on me. And this love of wilderness and the oceans was really a direct cause, a direct result of all that time that I spent outside. So yeah, I mean, and that has definitely led to my position now, what I'm doing right now in ocean sciences.
Mm-hmm. And you were particularly fascinated by the creatures. I mean, there's a sense of wonder in a lot of what you do and what you talk about. What are the most remarkable sea creatures that you've encountered?
Well, that's interesting. When I was a kid, one of my favorite things to do actually would be to go down by the seashore and find as many organisms as I could, limpets, sea cucumbers, fish, whatever I could find, mussels, and put them into a saucepan and cook them up and sample them. And I don't know why, I just wanted to try them all. And so I ended up, you know, trying barnacles, all these different things, and I love doing it. And one of the things that I find so fascinating right now is the fact that we think we know an ecosystem, and in reality, we only know a little tiny piece of it. And so I'll give you an example. But I mentioned before how I went up to, well, my folks have a place on Quadra Island. And so when we were young, we would go there in the summertime. And I went there every year for about 25 years. And I thought I knew the intertidal zone there very, very well. And it turns out, only a couple years ago, I discovered that there was this fish, a species of fish that resided in that intertidal place that I had never known about. And they're about this big. They come there every summer. They're there between April and August. And the amazing thing about this fish is that it sings. And so every summertime, the male fish, they're called a toadfish, will actually sing to the females to attract them to come and mate with them. And so first of all, you have this influx of a huge amount of biomass into the intertidal system. And then on top of that, you have this song that they're singing every night for months on end, and I didn't even know about it. So, I mean, I guess that speaks to the fact that I was unobservant, but also it speaks to the fact that we don't know everything. And so that's actually what I'm doing my PhD research on right now, is this fish. And so I guess at the moment that would be my most favorite.
Well, I was curious about the fact that you were doing your research on the impact of anthropogenic human-caused noise on fish. We know a lot about, or I shouldn't say we know a lot about, but I've certainly been aware of that as being a big issue with whales.
Absolutely.
But fish, tell me about...
Yeah, and you're exactly right. We know a little bit about the effects of noise whales, cetaceans, even seals. But what we're finding is it's not only the marine mammals that are affected, it's also octopus, crabs, fish, other animals as well. And I was really interested in fish because obviously, there's so many different species on our North Pacific coast, and nobody's really paying attention to them. And so companies are now, a lot of shipping companies, tanker companies, are able to say there is no significant effect of anthropogenic noise on fish populations. And the only reason they can say that is because there hasn't been any studies done on them. And so when I found out there was this fish literally, up and down the coast from Alaska all the way down to California, that depends so much on singing, on communication, vocal communication, I thought, well, hey, maybe there is a potential for shipping noise to mask the song of this fish. If all these shipping companies are saying that they can come down and they have no effect, their noise has no effect on fish, well, maybe that's something I need to look into.
And the fact that something is not known does not mean that it's not so.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
Isn't that one of the things that they use a lot in those kinds of circumstances?
But it's the whole precautionary approach, right? That needs to be followed.
Yeah. Well, what are the most important things that people need to understand about the oceans? How's that for a huge one? But but it comes sort of naturally out of this, right?
I mean, we need to know that we come from the oceans. Our very evolution, is found in the seas. We depend on the oceans. Every second breath we take comes from the oxygen produced by the sea. Of course, we eat a lot of the animals that come out of there, and our well-being is so dependent on the ocean. You think about if you're sick, sometimes your doctor will say, just relax, go to the seashore for a while and just get that peace back. And I think for us who live along the coast, that is something that we know. But for other people who don't necessarily live right next to the ocean, it's something that might be a little bit further from their minds. So this is something we really have to explain in a way that everybody can understand.
I think that you just passed by very quickly something that very few people know, which is that half of our oxygen comes from the sea. Mm-hmm. That's it. People who are nowhere near the sea are breathing from it.
Yeah, and that's a really good way to connect people, because often we think of, I hear people say that the Amazon rainforests are like the lungs of our world, but you could say the very same thing about our oceans. And so if we think about how we treat our oceans, then they're directly related to our own well-being. And so I like to say that oceans are downstream of everything. If we throw away a plastic bag or a cup or something, inevitably that will end up in the ocean. And sometimes that will end up in the belly of an albatross or inside a sea turtle.
They're also upstream from everything, aren't they? Because they really are where we come from. They are where much of what we need to live comes out of them too. So
that's a really good point. It's true. A little while ago, there was a study that came out of the University of Victoria by a man named Tom Reimken. And he produced an incredible study that showed the interconnectedness of our land and our oceans. And what he did was he spent a lot of time up north by rivers and in forests. And he noticed that the forests that were close to streams and close to rivers, they tended to have trees that were really, really big. And so he spent a lot of time just observing. And he also did some core sampling of the trees because he wanted to know why they were so big. And what he found was there was this element that was inside the trees, nitrogen-13 I think it was, that is usually only associated with marine organisms and marine things. And so he thought, well, why are we finding that in trees? And what he figured out was when salmon come up to their natal streams, so they're born in the stream, they go out, they grow up, and they go into the ocean. And when they come back to the very same streams where they were born, they reproduce and then they die. And then animals from the forest, like wolves and bears, will come take their bodies, bring them into the forest, eat them, and the rest of that body will actually disintegrate into the soil, into the mosses, into the shrubs, and into the trees that surround these rivers. And so those compounds that are found in salmon that have been out to sea are now brought back and found in the leaves of these trees and in all these organisms, these insects, the moss that surround the banks. So it was just such a beautiful story showcasing how we're all connected, and you really can't put boundaries on land and ocean and separate all these ecosystems because they're so profoundly connected.
Yeah, really totally interwoven.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the problems with marine management is we really like to put boundaries on things. And what I'm really opposed to is the idea that we can have a land park and an ocean park, but we don't generally try to tie them together, right? And so what happens on the land and what happens in the ocean will affect each other. So we have to start looking at the world as an entire system.
And having said all this about the importance of the oceans, you're not very hopeful about them, right? You've said the future of the oceans looks bleak.
Do I seem so jaded?
no, but we're worried, and I think properly so.
I mean, absolutely. If you read all these scientific reports, then there's no reason to be hopeful. If all these projections that are coming out right now are accurate, then the oceans are heading towards disaster, and that's something that we've been learning about for years now. I don't think that it is completely hopeless in the sense that we can't affect some types of positive change right now, and that's why we're pushing so hard. But in the face of climate change, which is now acidifying our oceans and heating them up, it is very hard to think that we are going to turn things around in time, because these changes are now actually happening. So this is why I think it is so important for scientists to speak out, because there really isn't any time to waste.
So tell me a little bit about that relationship between emissions into the atmosphere and what happens to the ocean, because I think that's another one that is not familiar to many people.
Yeah, I mean, we know a little bit about what happens to our air and in the atmosphere, but what we don't really think about is the fact that these chemical reactions are not only working in the air, but they're also affecting the very chemistry of our oceans. And so when the acidity of our oceans is increasing, this changes the relationship of the organisms living in there. And so some of these animals aren't able to build shells anymore because the acidity is too high, and so they're starting to die. And of course, if you have temperatures of the water that are increasing, and you have an animal that can only live in a certain degrees of water, and now it's too hot for them, well, what are they going to do? They're either going to migrate up to cooler waters, or they're probably going to die. And so these types of things, these patterns that are happening right now, these changes, are being documented in some fishery science institutions, and they're seeing that fish are tending to migrate to the colder regions right now. So how is this gonna change everything? I mean, we really don't know.
And you've studied with Daniel Pauly, who was one of our great interviews. We did a wonderful time with him. But he used this concept of shifting baselines. Mm-hmm. And it occurs to me and you've also said that you've seen changes in the ocean in your own lifetime, significant changes in the ocean in your own lifetime. So we've now got another baseline for the next people coming along, right?
Oh my gosh, it's so scary. And I think that idea that Daniel came up with a little while ago, shifting baselines, is a really good way to think about things, because there is such a difference in what we perceive as pristine depending on what generation you're from. And even for me to talk to my father, for instance, about how things used to be in Vancouver, it shocks me. The animals, the fish that he used to be able to go fishing for when he was a kid, there's no way I would even think about fishing in the waters close to where we live anymore, because there's nothing there. And so I think it is really important to have that intergenerational conversation, and that's another piece of the puzzle that we need to hear more about, because that isn't happening right now, and I think it's important.
Well, you're one of the youngest people we've had on this show, and you're right. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of conversation going on across the generations.
Mm-hmm. I think it is really important that we talk to young people for a bunch of reasons. Obviously, because they need to know what's going on, but for ourselves as well. And I mean, I'm not that old, but I definitely already feel like sometimes I'm overwhelmed, and I am a little bit jaded, and it's hard to think that we're going to have a difference. And I remember I was a teaching assistant for a scientist, actually Tom Reimken from UVic, who I was talking about before, a couple years ago. And one of the classes we were teaching was biology of fish. And so we did some historical stuff on fisheries. And the students in my class didn't know about the state of the oceans. They didn't know how bad things were. And so I gave them some papers to give them some context and to read about it. And it was really amazing to watch people who had never known about it suddenly realize the severity of the problems. And it was quite emotional. They went from being very sad and kind of shocked to really outraged and angry that this was happening. And then finally to, okay, what are we going to do about this? We're going to become proactive. And in this little class of people, of students, I watched them mobilize amongst themselves and make commitments and decide to write to the government and decide to take more courses. And that was so uplifting and so important for me to see, you know, that there is this energy and this anger from the younger people, and this will hopefully catalyze things and move us in the direction we need to go.
That's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
Because I'm one of the ones that, little stories about historical memory that really struck me from the BC coast is Eric Wickham and that Fat Cats and Dead Fish. In it he talks about a place called the Goose Island Bank, which is now a dead mud bank, but used to produce huge amounts of halibut. And when he mentioned this to, because I think he'd caught halibut there, when he mentioned this to a DFO guy, the DFO guy said, I didn't know anybody ever fished there. And you sort of have to think to yourself, how can that be with an agency which is charged with the preservation and, you know, of the species?
Oh my gosh, yikes.
But there's the shifting baseline, right?
Yeah, no, it's very true. And that's why historical records are so important. And even if we don't have, you know, data or databases with all the numbers in it, the catch and all that, there's a lot of, you know, the oral traditions that have been alive on the West Coast in particular, paintings, art, stories, a lot of that holds a lot of information that we can learn from as well.
You have a wonderful story about your dresser. And you know, it occurred to me that it was kind of like a model for the codfish collapse.
Oh, well, maybe you can tie in that analogy, but I think the story that you're referring to is the one I mentioned last night, in that, yeah, I was cleaning up my room and there was a dresser that I had that I always just heap all my clothes on, and I decided, I'm going to clean that up. I'm going to make space so that I can put the things that I want to on that dresser. And so one day I went about and I put everything away and it was totally clean. And I came down a few hours later and my partner had put all his things on top. And it occurred to me in that moment that this is an analogy for what's happening in the whole world. And the reason I say that is because a lot of the time when we're talking about greenwashing and all that, we say, you as an individual can affect change. If you just change your light bulbs, if you start walking instead of taking the car, we can turn this around. And the problem is if you do that, or if I decided that I wasn't going to fly anymore and I was going to give up, you know, anything that wasn't within my 100-mile radius, you know, I was going to eat locally and all that, that's all and well and good for me to do that. That's important. We should be doing it. But it doesn't mean it's going to stop you from doing those very same things. And so the analogy with the dresser is I can clean my room, I can do these things, but it doesn't mean someone else isn't going to come and put their stuff on my dresser. And that is why we need legislation at a really high level that will put these restraints in so that we don't have to be the ones always criticizing ourselves and making these decisions day to day, because that's impossible.
I saw another application of that, and it's to the codfish collapse, which is because here we are in 1994. This is one of the great ecological disasters in human history, is the collapse of that enormous codfish resource. We were in charge of it, Canadians, and people told us it was coming, and we went right ahead and acted as we did. And then the moratorium comes along and say, okay, well, the codfish will come back. They haven't come back. It's 15 years, getting on for 20 years, haven't come back. And the hypothesis I keep hearing is that other things have simply moved into the vacuum created by the loss of the codfish, just as your partner's clothes moved onto the vacuum created by your cleanup. Does that make sense to you?
Well, I'm wondering, what do you mean other things have come into the...
Well, the things that used to rely on the, or things that would have competed with the codfish are now able to flourish. We've had a huge explosion of lobsters, for example.
Oh, right,
So
yeah.
so in effect, it's as though the codfish leaves the house, and when they come back, there's somebody living there.
Ah,
right?
I see.
Nature abhors a vacuum. There is no
Yeah.
vacuum. It doesn't last long. And so so you think, well, if we lay off fishing, then the stock will rebound. Well, maybe it will, but after 15 or 20 years, you've got to wonder if it's ever coming back.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because a lot of fishing management we think is about managing the fish stocks or managing the seals and all this stuff, but you can't manage natural things. You can manage yourselves, right? Like we can manage people and our decisions. And so I think it's really strange when we completely deplete populations, and I don't know that much about the cod and what's happening here, but in other things, definitely. And then we say, oh, now there's too many seals, or now there's too many whales, and that's why we have to kill them all. And so we've gone from killing all the fish, now we're gonna say we're gonna kill all the seals and kill all the whales, but we're not thinking about it as our own problem. You know, nature has existed for a long time without us, and it's been perfectly okay. And then we come in and think that we have to manage all these things, and it's not the right way to look at things.
Yeah, you're right. And the only animal we can really manage is the human animal.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's talk about that, because your MA was on the, well, it was about the management of the high seas. First off, what are the high seas?
So the high seas are areas of ocean that are beyond national jurisdiction or beyond the 200 nautical mile limit of coastal countries. And they actually comprise the majority of our global oceans, so that's about 60%. And we don't normally talk that much about the high seas. We don't know that much about them, but a lot of biomass is actually found in these areas. And so in coastal countries, we know that our government will manage the stocks and the resources within it. But when it comes to the other ocean that's way out there, we don't really think about what's going on. And so my research was really looking at the effectiveness of these international fishing bodies that were fishing on the high seas. And what I found was these organizations are actually mandated to manage and conserve these fish stocks in the high seas. So I went about evaluating their effectiveness. And one of the results I had was that 2/3 of all fish stocks on the high seas are either overexploited or depleted. And so they're absolutely not maintaining their mandates. In fact, they're failing the high seas. And so those were some of the results that I had. And I think that is pretty shocking because you know, even a few decades ago, we didn't think that we could have an impact on the high seas because they were too far away, and we didn't have the technology to really reach those animals that were out there. But now we're finding that the majority of these fish stocks are now depleted or overfished. I mean, that's really shocking.
It is. And when you talk about the need for regulation, we talk about the need for regulation, there it is. And how do you make it actually work?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the irony of having industry in charge of conserving the stocks, right? I mean, these are fishing organizations, and they're the ones who are supposed to set these limits, and clearly it's not working. So there has to be another form of legislation. They can't be the ones in charge of it. There has to be another body outside of that.
But you know, this is a kind of common way of doing things right across the board, is to hand it all over to the industries and say they say that they'll control it. And I think you actually said that their big concern had been the direction of the fishery, right? That actually helping people to catch fish rather than helping to conserve them, right?
Yeah. And when I did have that small interaction with industry face to face, I was really shocked because I thought, well, certainly we all want the same thing, which is healthy stocks. I mean, your very organization depends on a healthy stock. You want to be able to fish forever. You want your kids to be able to continue to fish. But they were arguing. And I think the problem is the short-sightedness of these things, right? So we're thinking about, you know, the next few years, I want to be getting all these fish, and that maybe that's what happened with the cod collapse as well. We were taking too much without really looking at what is going to happen afterwards.
I think that's true, and I think it's really shocking that there's so little consideration for what comes afterwards. I mean, and it's less and less forgivable as we know more. I mean, having had your research, you would think they would stop and say, oh, maybe we, but very often the regulators are captives of the industry, even if they aren't actually the industry themselves. Right?
Yeah, no, it's true. And of course, when we're talking about politics and government decisions, well, they're on a short-term basis anyway, so they don't have foresight. They're only looking at the next 4 years or whatever, so, yeah.
That's right, and that seems to me to be one of the really key issues on practically every major issue. You know?
That's a big flaw, absolutely.
Yeah, it is. So then let's go, so that's the high seas, that doesn't look very good. Right? Now let's come to the 200.
Well, I mean, we're focusing on the things that are going wrong, and it is primarily going wrong, but the good news is that people are starting to talk about these things now, and the high seas are being brought closer to home. There are organizations that are out there that are fighting for the high seas and speaking on behalf of all those resources. But yeah, at this stage, in terms of implementation and policy, which is always what seems to slow us down, we're still at square one.
And now if we come to the 200-mile limit and come inside it, how are we doing there?
Oh, God. Well, I mean, I hate to be so negative, but we're not doing well. I mean, in Canada, about 1% of our oceans are protected. And on the West Coast, I can say definitely that even though we have quite a few marine protected areas, they don't really mean anything because they're paper parks. So that means our government has said, okay, we're going to install these things, but we're not necessarily going to regulate things. We're not going to monitor. And so as a result, it's kind of ineffective. And I think that could be even more dangerous because we think that we have these protected areas, but if they're not doing anything, then that's a problem.
And that leads me to ask about things like other ways of trying to do that, like the individual transferable quotas, which really, in a sense, privatize pieces of the catch in advance, right?
Yeah.
What do you think of the impact of those?
I mean, I think that in some cases they can work. There are a lot of problems with them as well, though, and it's very hard in some fisheries to get access to these, or they run down through the family, or it allows big people with a lot of money to be able to get all the catch shares, and then what about everybody else? So it's not perfect for everybody. I think that in some circumstances they can be part of the solution, but that is only a piece. And so when we're talking about ocean management, we're talking about marine protected areas, absolutely those are a necessity. We need more of them. They need to be functional though. And what about climate change? What about all these things, pollution, that don't necessarily fit into that? So you can have a protected area, but if cruise ships are still dumping their garbage, if an oil spill happens, if climate change is acidifying our oceans, they're unprotected to those dangers. So we have to be talking about big picture type of management. How do we make our oceans more resilient to the things that are going to happen that we can't necessarily predict, like the effects of climate change? And all these pieces have to be part of the solution and thought of when we're doing the ocean management planning.
So how do we do that?
Oh my God, yeah, no kidding. That's a big question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're moving in that direction when we're talking about more of an ecosystem approach, and that's something that has been touted recently as really where we have to head. Also, the idea that we have to include all the different sectors, the fishing communities, the industry, government, First Nations, students, scientists, activists, NGOs, all these are resource holders. I mean, we all have a stake in our seas. And so these types of meetings, even though they can seem like they take forever and they're boring and all that, they are allowing a platform for us to have these conversations. So it is happening. It's taking too long, but I think we're kind of moving in that direction.
When we think about marine protected areas as a way of responding to the loss of stocks and giving them a chance to rebuild, that's got to be huge, a huge area. That can't be a little paper park. It can't be a little park either. It's got to be a big piece of the sea, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, I think so, definitely. But studies have shown that even small protected areas can make a big difference. And actually, I was just in French Polynesia over the winter and visiting some people, and I went snorkeling. I know. I don't know if I should bring that up, but it was my honeymoon. And so we went snorkeling and diving in a tiny marine reserve. I mean, it was really, really small. And I have never in my life seen that amount of abundance before. There were so many different species of fish, like thick. You could barely move. I kept bumping into snapper. And it was because they had protected this area, and fishermen were fishing around it, but still inside, you could really see the effects. And the fishermen all really respected those limits because they could see for themselves that the stocks had rebounded and what a difference it had made. So I think that small MPAs, they can make a difference. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be bigger. Absolutely, I think we need big ones. But on top of that, I think we need to look upstream and talk about the land and ocean protection together. And this is actually something that's happened off the west coast of British Columbia on Haida Gwaii. And so the southern third of Haida Gwaii is designated as a park. And that happened in the 80s. And then just a couple years ago, in 2010, they decided to extend the boundaries from the land park out into the ocean. And now it is the first big park that has, you know, the top of the mountains protected all the way down to the bottom of the ocean floor. And that is really amazing. And that's something we have to be doing all across Canada.
That's phenomenal.
It is.
Yeah.
It's great. And it's a joint initiative. It's led by the Council of the Haida First Nations and also DFO and Parks Canada. So the three of them are working together to make this park system work.
Well, when you said they decided, I was going to ask you who's the they in that sense.
Well, the they actually is the Haida people. It all came from them. And they were the ones who wanted the park. The terrestrial park back in the 80s, they were the ones who blockaded and said, no logging here, this is our land. You know, we want to be able to be in charge of it like we have been for the last 10, 12,000 years. And so it came from them. They pushed and the government responded.
It's occurred to me and to others, I think, a number of times that it may very well be that the First Nations are the most powerful instrument that nature has at her disposal in dealing with some of these things. And
well, we absolutely. I mean, we have such a wealth of knowledge from these people who live here, and we really need to be learning from them. And I'm really intrigued by the I Don't Know More movement. I think it's a really progressive, positive thing, and I'm so glad that it's happening. We really need to listen to them and talk to them about what they want and what they see for our nation.
Well, and you think about the native tradition of thinking about things in terms of 7 generations. You know, boy, what a contrast that is with the way that we're doing things now.
I know, if you think that in only 50 years we can have had such an impact on our environment, and then that they have lived, you know, pretty much in balance, especially in Canada, with their resources, with the environment for so long. I mean, they have a lot of information, they have a lot of knowledge. We should really talk to them about it.
The word wisdom comes to mind.
Yeah, exactly, wisdom.
Yeah, I recently had a conversation like this with a Cree leader from James Bay, and he said, you know, that over 10,000 years they figured a few things out. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and just to add to that, you know, for my research right now, as I said, I'm studying this singing fish. And in all the academic literature, they say that they found out that the fish could sing around 1900s. This is when we really found all this information out. And so then I was reading these stories that were based on folklore, these stories of First Nations on the coast. And they've been passing down these stories for a long, long time, millennia probably. And they, of course, talk about the singing fish, and they've known about this for a long time. And obviously that makes a lot of sense because they lived on the ocean for thousands of years. So we forget, you know, that learning about things isn't just in the form of research, like we know it, but it has to do with wisdom that, as you say, that is being passed down from generation to generation that way.
The other thing, I guess, that I've always thought about marine protected areas, and you've shaken it up a little bit, was I've tended to think of them as being almost museum-like.
I find it really frustrating that we are still today producing all these studies trying to tell everybody that yes, marine protected areas do work and this is why. And so it's painstaking. You know, you actually go out, you collect the data, you have to do the before, after, and these are our results, and yes, it does work. And we've been doing these studies for decades. And when you think about it, before humans came along, I mean, the entire ocean was a marine protected area, right? They were marine reserves, and it worked. So why do we now have to try to explain and do the experiments to show that it worked when we have all of history to show that it worked? So that's just something I find frustrating.
Well, it is, and it has to do with our sense of ownership and our sense of separateness from the world we live in. Right? Because if you own something, you can do anything you like with it. But if it's separate from you, if it has rights of its own,
yeah,
then it becomes, and that's the way that the First Nations have always seen it.
Yeah, that's true.
You've also said, when it comes to ocean management, I'm getting used to feeling embarrassed to be Canadian. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, it's just, it really makes me feel strange when the government says, we are world-class leaders in science and in ocean protection. And definitely we have amazing scientists in Canada. And now certainly, now that I'm doing my degree in England, I can see what a hub, especially for ocean science, Canada really is. But in terms of what we're doing with that science and how we're treating scientists right now in Canada, it's shameful. So how can you call us leading the world when you're not even allowing us to speak out about these things? So yeah, I am ashamed to be from Canada because of these things. We're not world-class leaders in ocean management. We're just not. Even the States has more marine protection comparatively in their coast than we do. And Australia, I mean, come on, 40% of their coasts are protected. Yeah, and Canada, we have the longest coastline of any country in the world. So you'd think we would want to step up and protect more than 1% of our oceans.
But we don't, and we've actually been retrograde in some of the decisions that this government has taken, right? In terms of
absolutely.
Protection of species and that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely gutting the Fisheries Act. I mean, the list goes on. I was actually trying to print out a list of all the things, of all the regressions that we've done over the last couple of years. And I printed out 3 pages. I mean, there's so many things. And the other scary thing, of course, is that they're trying to pass all these bills through without any discussion. I mean, they're really trying to do it quickly. And the public is still trying to scratch our heads saying, what's going on? Could this actually be? But if all of these, environmental protection acts and stuff that we have are being gutted like this, I mean, this has serious consequences down the road.
You were saying that studying in England, that you found people were quite, I'm not quite sure, removed, I guess, or
disconnected
from the sea. But they're in a much smaller country with the sea all around them. So I'm a little surprised that you found that.
Yeah.
But I suspect the same thing's true in Canada. That the number of, like in the States, the big cities, and in most countries, the big cities are on the oceans. Here, the big cities are inland, with the exception of Vancouver, really. But,
yeah, I mean, in England it was really apparent because they love watching celebrity chefs there, and they're really into their reality TV, much more so, I think, than in Canada. And so what you're finding is celebrity chefs now are leading the movement for sustainable seafood, and they're actually being very effective. And it's wonderful. I mean, they have such a control in one sense over the citizens because so many people watch their shows. And so they have been able to be effective and get the word out, and it's great. There's been a lot of engagement that way. But I just found it a little bit ironic, as you say, that it is, a coastal, it's an island, right? And why don't they have their own type of interaction with their coasts? And it's because it's been so degraded. So people aren't, there aren't very many little fishermen that are going off and catching these fish, and a lot of their animals are gone now. 80% of their stocks are gone. And so now I just found it a little bit sad that they were learning about their oceans through their celebrity chefs. But at the same time, I mean, if this is where you can get information, then power to them, you might as well get it somewhere.
There's another sad story that I remember about from my backgrounds in literature, and one of the leading literary figures in the 19th century in England was Sir Edmund Gosse. And his father was a naturalist who frequented the shores of actually all over England, I guess, and wrote at length about what was there, the majesty and the magnificence of the intertidal zone, and all the animals that lived there and so forth. The book was so successful that everybody flocked to the intertidal zone, and the effect of it was to clean it all out.
No way.
Yeah, part of the reason that is so barren is because people got so fascinated with it.
Wow, that's interesting.
Isn't that an ironic story?
That really is. So it was too effective.
You also feel very strongly that a scientist should communicate. Tell me more about that, and about, because that's a different set of skills, isn't it? I mean, the scientific skills are one thing, the communication skills are something, and most people they don't normally seem to occur in the same people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, science communication obviously has been something that these types of values I've been steeped in since a kid because of my family and my upbringing. But for my father, I mean, he was born in Canada. He's third generation Japanese Canadian. And then when the war broke out, he was thrown into an internment camp and treated like an enemy. And so I think for him, there are a lot of deep set experiences that have happened to him that make him a lot more intolerant to injustice than maybe somebody else. And so when he went into science, he loved genetics. I mean, that was his field, and he poured his life into it for a while. But at the same time, what was happening is scientists and other people were using science as a way to promote racism and to say that, oh, these are the facts, you know, this set of people have bigger brains than this set, or women aren't as smart as this, and all these things, and actually giving credence to things that were wrong. And so my father, having gone through those experiences of injustice and racism himself, realized that this is something that we need to become educated about. We need to be able to understand science so that we can know when we're being told lies. And so although he loved genetics and he loved teaching and he loved the science, he also knew that there was a big gap in that we didn't have the people to be able to communicate all the stuff that was happening in academia to everybody else. So he left science and started communicating. He started doing the nature of things. He's been doing it for so long now, actually. But also, of course, that wasn't all he did. He became a real big environmentalist. And championing the ideas that we are connected to the environment. There is no separation between us and the air and the soil and the food that we eat. So these were all kind of part of the same thing, which boils down to that intolerance for injustice and that we all need to know what's going on. And so for me now, growing up being here in 2013, but growing up through the 80s and 90s and watching what's happened, and now, with our government trying to silence the scientists, it's really scary because if we can't reach out to people and say, this is what our work is, these are what our results show, then how is anybody going to learn anything, right? I mean, all we're doing is talking about our data. How is that wrong for a scientist?
Well, it's wrong because the data shows that the world is not the way the government thinks it should be.
And that's scary because if we're talking about truth, then the truth is being stifled right now.
And I suspect that's actually quite a deliberate part of the policy.
And it could be very effective. And getting rid of all these historical records that we're trying to do right now, we're getting rid of information. We're getting rid of history. That is very scary.
Shrinking Library and Archives Canada very sharply. And same policy.
The surveys, you know, the long-form surveys that we're cutting out, we don't want to know what Canada is. We don't want to know who the individuals are. We're going to start from scratch. We're going to make up that stuff. So, terrifying.
It's hard to believe that we've lived to see pretty much a war on knowledge by our own government.
And we have to remember that we live in a democracy, and so it is up to us to stand up and say something. I mean, that's what a democracy is all about.
Is it having a chilling effect on your generation of scientists that this climate has developed around us?
You know, I think that for my generation of scientists, I'm actually, and I spoke about this a little bit last night, but that is what gives me a bit of hope, is that we have come into this from a different perspective because we were born at a different time. So we were born, and everything we learned from then on was that, you know, our world is headed for disaster. Our oceans are really messed up. And so we're sick of it. We're sick of going along the same line as the generation before us, knowing where we're headed and not doing anything about it. So what we want to do is throw out the model that the generation before us had and start doing something new. And so the whole notion of scientists shouldn't be able to speak out, you know, it's not our job to communicate, all that stuff, that's so outdated, that's archaic. We don't believe in that anymore. Now it's become, okay, we're doing good science, and then what? What are we going to do with that science? And so a lot of the young students students that I've been meeting with have said the same things. That how do I make my science matter? How do I get this out into the public? And how do I get it into the right policy measures? So I think there has been a really big shift in what we define as the role of a scientist. And I'm so hopeful with that, because that means everything, right? Like, that is just one part of our work. We're going to do that good science, but there's a whole lot of other things that we're going to do as well.
People are, I presume, taking the time to become much more media savvy and thinking much more about how communication goes on in the broader community?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that just comes with growing up in a generation where it's just part of your everyday life. And I mean, certainly everybody, you know, uses email, has blogs and websites, and I don't have Facebook or Twitter, but I mean, most people do. And so it's a lot easier when you've grown up with that kind of stuff to be able to use it. And so a lot of scientists now there's even people who are doing videos to their publications. So now you have the written paper, and now you have a little video that kind of summarizes what you said in that dense literature. So it's great. I mean, I think we're reaching out a lot more, and hopefully that will see an impact.
Kind of like a little video abstract.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is.
Isn't that a wonderful thought?
Yeah, it's a cute idea.
Yeah, it is.
Absolutely.
It'd be very effective. One of the things you know, I've often felt is that with something like The Living Beach, that I was doing the translation the other way on. I was going out and finding out about the science, and in order to be able to bring it to a broader public, and as opposed to the scientist who's now trying to, in a sense, I had the media skills and was looking for the science.
Yes.
They have the science and are looking for the media skills.
Right, right.
But we meet in the middle talking about real things. I was going to ask you at the end, do you have hope and how do you sustain it? But I think you've explained that with the young scientists.
Oh, good. Yeah, I really think that that's where the key lies. I mean, it doesn't mean that the older generations are, you know, passing the torch. I hate that expression, because it sounds to me like they're just wiping their hands clean of it and saying, here, we made this mess, now on to you guys, you can decide how to clean it up. So I think we all have to be part of this, and I think that intergenerational commentary that we were talking about before is key, and we don't really talk about it very much, but we need to draw on the knowledge of our elders and our older people, and then we need to couple that with the strength and the energy and the time of our youth, and then together, that's really how I think we can push forward.
Actually, the one other thing that as I reflect back on this conversation, the other theme I'd like to come back to, I guess, is we seem to have imposed regulatory stuff on regulations and regulatory regimes in various parts of the sea, well, elsewhere too, but in various parts of the sea, and they have failed to actually change things very much. Mm-hmm. So I guess the question, the big question that's probably going to come out, that I'm going to be thinking about after this conversation, is how do we make those things real? You know, how do we get this? You've got the regimes out in the high seas, for example, and they've, if anything, been a negative influence, right? They've helped to make a more effective fishery. So that's the one that really is puzzling me, and I've always been puzzled by people who can know the right thing to do and do the wrong thing, and that, you know, just on an individual human basis, how can you do that? Don't you care about your grandchildren? You know?
No, I know. There's something though about, I mean, being part of something that is damaging our planet. I mean, we're all complicit in that, right? I mean, I took a flight to be here in Halifax, and there is a disconnect when you can't see those impacts happening directly to you or to your family. It has to be very immediate. And so we need to be able to talk about these things in ways that resonate with everybody. So they do have to come down to, what about your child? You know, what about the people that you love? And with regulation in the oceans is really hard, because so much of what happens is out there. Even to people who live on the coast, we don't see every day what's happening underneath the waters, right? We see, oh, it looks like a still day, it looks beautiful out there, everything's okay, but we don't really know. And when it comes to regulation, it's really hard to be regulating, you know, 70% of our world. It's so vast. So yeah, it is a big challenge, and certainly we've done a bit better job on land, but yeah, we're going to have to really open up to a diversity of approaches to get to a solution.
It's one of the things that impresses me so much about Paul Watson, is that he is actually enforcing what we say we want, but aren't enforcing it. I don't know if that's a model we're going to use elsewhere, but it's pretty hard. It's a pretty unassailable position for him to take, which is we've all passed this. We've all said this is what we want.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and nobody's doing anything. Yeah.
I have a lot of time for Paul Watson. I think he is a very brave and different person, and a person that we need, absolutely. He is one of the only people who is actually walking his talk. I actually invited him to give a talk at our Fisheries Center lecture series, and there were scientists in my building who would not come downstairs and watch his talk because they're so angry at what he does. And that's too bad, you know, because I think we can all learn from each other. But one of the things he said in his speech that I thought was so important was, we need a diversity of approaches. It's not going to be from one way, one angle, that we're going to fix the world, we're going to save our oceans. It has to be from every angle. And so Paul wasn't saying all of us need to go out into the southern seas and, you know, say to the Japanese whalers that you need to go home. That wasn't it. That's what he's doing. But he's saying to the scientists, you know, continue to do your work. And he's saying to the artists, continue to promote your stuff through art and all this stuff. And this is one of the things that when we speak to young people primarily about, we say, go with your heart, you know, go with your passion, because that is really going to give you that strength and that endurance to follow through with it. And then from there, bring your strengths and your talents to the cause. And I think that is absolutely integral, because it's not just going to be from one person or one way of finding a solution. It has to be from all these different angles.
Sarika Cullis-Suzuki, scientist, speaker, broadcaster, and advocate for the oceans. If you enjoyed this interview, you'll probably want to see our interviews with Alexandra Morton, defender of the wild salmon, and Alana Mitchell, author of Seasick, The Global Ocean in Crisis. Oh, and you should check out our interview with Daniel Pauly, who was Sarika Cullis-Suzuki's thesis supervisor when she did her MSc at the University of British Columbia. For The Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. See you next time.